Before we begin, if you enjoy our content, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these stories. Now let's talk about what happens when a 12,000-year empire mistakes human patience for primitive weakness. Grand Admiral Vitheran Cas stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Sovereignty, and looked out at the stars with the calm confidence of a man who had never lost anything in his life. Not a battle, not a ship, not even a minor skirmish. In 40 years of service to the Zerith Imperium, he had crushed every enemy he'd faced with such overwhelming force that most surrendered before he fired a single shot. Behind him, the bridge crew worked in absolute silence. They knew better than to speak when the Admiral was thinking. The soft hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, steady and deep, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Everything about the Eternal Sovereignty spoke of power and permanence. The bridge was vast, designed to impress and intimidate. Holographic displays floated in the air, showing tactical information in cool blue light. The viewport stretched across the entire forward wall, offering an unobstructed view of the galaxy the Imperium owned. The Zerith Imperium had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. 12,000 years without a single defeat. 40,000 star systems bent the knee to the Emperor on Zerith Prime. Entire species had been conquered, absorbed, and put to work building the Empire's glory. Some had fought, all had lost. The mathematical certainty of Zerith military superiority had been proven over and over across millennia until it became simple fact, as undeniable as gravity or the speed of light. Vitheran Cas was the sharpest blade in the Empire's hand. He had crushed the Polari resistance in 9 days, a conflict other admirals had estimated would take months. He had burned the Dvaki rebellion out of existence in 3 weeks, turning their 17 colony worlds into examples that kept 100 other species quietly obedient. His name was spoken with fear on 1,000 worlds. Children on conquered planets were told stories about the Admiral who never showed mercy, who never accepted anything less than absolute surrender. And now the Imperial court had given him a new assignment. He almost laughed when he'd read the orders. Almost. Grand Admirals of the Zerith Imperium did not laugh. They did not show amusement or doubt or anything that might suggest the universe was anything other than exactly what they expected it to be. The target was Sol 3, a tiny blue world orbiting a small yellow star in the far arm of the galaxy. A region so remote and insignificant that most Zerith navigators had never even bothered to chart properly. The natives called their world Earth. Imperial intelligence had classified it as a Class 2 pre-spacefaring civilization. That designation meant the creatures living there had figured out how to split atoms and send tin cans into orbit around their own planet. Impressive for primitives, perhaps, but they had no faster-than-light travel, no energy shields, no directed energy weapons, no planetary defense grid, no orbital infrastructure worth mentioning. They still burned dead plants for fuel. They still fought wars among themselves over invisible lines drawn on maps, over resources they didn't know how to efficiently extract, over ideologies that would be meaningless the moment the Imperium arrived. By every measure in the Imperial classification system, Earth was barely worthy of conquest. It was a backwater, a footnote, a planet full of creatures who'd only just stopped hitting each other with rocks. It was, by every conceivable standard, a waste of his talents. Cas turned from the viewport and walked to the central command table with measured steps. Everything the Admiral did was measured, controlled, perfect. A holographic image of Earth floated above the table in precise detail. Blue oceans, green and brown continents, swirling white clouds. It looked fragile. It looked like something he could break with one hand, like something that would shatter the moment he applied the slightest pressure. The 9th Expeditionary Fleet is assembled and ready, Admiral, said Subcommander Lyral Dova from her position across the command table. She was young for her rank, barely into her 5th decade, but she had a sharp mind and sharper eyes. Cas respected intelligence, even when he found caution tiresome. And Lyral was cautious by nature, always checking data twice, always questioning assumptions. It made her an excellent second officer. It also made her occasionally annoying. "Give me the numbers," Cas said, his voice carrying the precise, clipped authority that made junior officers straighten unconsciously. 480 warships, Lyral replied, pulling up displays with practiced efficiency. 12 planet crackers. 60,000 ground assault troops. Full supply chain for a 6-month occupation. She paused, her large eyes meeting his. "More than sufficient for a world of this classification, Admiral." "More than sufficient," Cas repeated with a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "This fleet could flatten 100 Earths before lunch. The court honors me with a vacation disguised as a mission." A few officers on the bridge allowed themselves quiet smiles at that. The mood was light, almost relaxed. This was not a war. This was barely even a military operation. This was an errand, a formality. The Imperium sent fleets to claim unclaimed territory the way bureaucrats file paperwork. Routine, methodical, inevitable. But Subcommander Lyral Dova did not smile. She touched the control table and brought up a secondary display. Lines of data scrolled across the holographic interface in pale blue light. Numbers and analysis that she'd clearly been studying for some time. "Admiral," she said carefully, "I want to bring something to your attention. It may be nothing, but I believe it deserves a moment of consideration." Cas raised one eyebrow, the only acknowledgement she would get that he was listening. "Over the past 130 years, Lyral continued, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of concern, the Imperium has sent 14 long-range reconnaissance probes into the Sol system. Standard deep space reconnaissance units designed to observe stellar phenomena and catalog potential conquest targets. They're autonomous, hardened against radiation and debris, designed to function for centuries." She looked at him directly. All 14 went dark. No wreckage was ever recovered. No final transmissions. No distress signals. They simply stopped sending data the moment they entered the inner system. The bridge went slightly quieter. Officers pretended not to listen, but everyone was paying attention now. This was unusual. Probe failures happened, but not like this. Cas leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the command table. His voice was low and patient, the way one might speak to a bright student who had made an understandable mistake. "Subcommander, probe failure is common in uncharted systems. Solar radiation degrades components. Debris fields destroy sensors. Gravitational anomalies disrupt communications. You know this." "I do, Admiral," Lyral said carefully. "But 14 out of 14 is unusual. The statistical probability of all probes failing for natural causes is less than 0.03%. 0.03%. That number sat in the air between them like a challenge. In the quiet of the bridge, it felt heavier than it should. Cas studied his second officer for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty born from 4 decades of unbroken victory. "Subcommander Dova, I have destroyed civilizations that could bend light and fold space. I have walked through the burning wreckage of species that thought themselves gods. I have conquered worlds defended by technology that made our own look primitive, and I did it with fewer ships than I have at my command today." He gestured at the holographic image of Earth. "And you're asking me to worry about a planet of apes who haven't left their own moon in decades? Who fight each other with chemical explosives and metal projectiles? Who can barely coordinate enough to feed their own population?" Lyral held his gaze for a moment, then looked down. "No, Admiral, I simply wished it noted in the record." "Noted," Cas said with finality. "And forgotten. Set course for Sol. We jump in 1 hour." The fleet moved into formation with the smooth precision that came from centuries of refined military doctrine. 480 warships arranged themselves around the massive bulk of the eternal sovereignty like wolves around their pack leader. Each ship took its assigned position with mathematical exactness. Heavy cruisers forming the outer shell, destroyers filling gaps, support vessels taking protected positions in the formation center. The planet crackers, each one large enough to cast a shadow over a small moon, took position at the rear. These were the Imperium's ultimate weapons, vessels designed for a single terrible purpose: to crack open a planet's crust and expose its molten core, to render an entire world uninhabitable for millennia. They were usually unnecessary. Their presence alone was often enough to convince a species that resistance was futile. Supply ships and troop carriers filled the remaining gaps in the formation. Assault shuttles hung in their bays like sleeping predators, waiting to descend on whatever primitive cities the creatures below called civilization. It was a sight that had brought entire civilizations to their knees before a single shot was fired. The visual alone, 480 warships arranged in perfect mathematical formation, had convinced dozens of species to surrender immediately upon seeing it. Why resist what could not be resisted? Why fight what could not be defeated? Cas watched from his command chair as the fleet aligned with the jump corridor, a precisely calculated route through faster-than-light space that would deliver them to Sol System in exactly 14 standard rotations. Every ship reported ready. Every system showed green. Everything was proceeding exactly as it always did. In 14 days, they would arrive at Sol. In 15, Earth would belong to the Imperium. The natives would be given a single chance to surrender. The Imperium was not needlessly cruel. If they accepted, they would become subjects of the Empire. Their world would be developed. Their resources would be extracted efficiently. Their population would be put to useful work. If they refused, Cas would turn their cities to glass and their oceans to steam. It was not cruelty. It was simply the way of things. The strong ruled. The weak served. This was the natural law of the universe. And the Zerith Imperium was its highest expression. 12,000 years of unbroken dominance proved that beyond any possible doubt. All ships report ready for jump, Admiral, Vitheran said from her station. Execute, Cas replied. The countdown reached 0. Space itself seemed to twist and fold around the fleet. The stars stretched into lines of white fire as 480 warships punched through the fabric of reality and disappeared into the swirling tunnel of faster-than-light travel. In the quiet that followed, Subcommander Vitheran sat alone at her station and pulled up the intelligence file on Sol 3 one more time. She scrolled past the standard data: population estimates, atmospheric composition, technological assessment, orbital satellite positions, and stopped on a section marked with a low-priority flag. It was a fragment of a transmission intercepted from Earth decades ago. A radio broadcast. The translation software had converted it into Imperial Zerith, and the words sat on her screen in pale blue light. It was a song, a human song. The words spoke of walking through storms, of holding your head high, of not being afraid, of standing tall when the wind and rain came. It was simple, almost childish by Zerith literary standards. Unsophisticated, repetitive, lacking the complex metaphorical structures that Zerith poetry prized. But something about it made Vitheran's skin prickle. She read it again, then a third time. Then she closed the file and stared at the swirling blue-white tunnel of FDL travel outside her viewport. She watched the distorted starlight streak past and tried to name the feeling that sat heavy in her chest. It was not fear exactly. She was a Zerith military officer. She had been trained to face fear and master it. This was something else, something older and deeper than fear. It was the feeling a small creature gets when it steps into a dark cave and realizes too late that something very large is already inside. Something that has been waiting. Something that was there long before you arrived. Watching, breathing, waiting. She said nothing. She told herself it was nothing. Just nerves. Just the natural anxiety any officer felt before a new operation, even a routine one. The fleet flew on toward Earth through the twisted dimensions of FTL space, carrying 480 warships and 60,000 soldiers toward a tiny blue world that didn't even know they were coming. The journey to Sol was supposed to take 14 standard rotations. For most of the fleet, those 14 days felt like a holiday. Officers dined on fine food from the Empire's conquered worlds, delicacies from species that had learned to cook for their masters. Soldiers played games in the recreation halls, their laughter echoing through corridors that usually rang with the sounds of combat preparation. They told jokes about the dirt dwellers they were about to conquer, about how quickly the primitives would surrender when they saw the fleet hanging in their sky, like judgment itself. Some even placed bets on how quickly the humans would surrender. The most generous estimate was 2 hours. The least generous was 30 minutes. No one seriously considered that they might resist. What would be the point? Grand Admiral Cas spent his days reviewing standard conquest protocols. It was a routine he had followed dozens of times before, so familiar it was almost meditative. Step 1. Destroy any orbital infrastructure. Step 2. Flatten military installations from orbit. Step 3. Broadcast surrender terms in the native language. Step 4. Deploy ground troops to secure population centers. Step 5. Install an Imperial governor. Simple, clean, done before dinner. He had no doubt it would go exactly as planned. The protocols have been refined over 12,000 years. They worked because they always worked. The Imperium did not lose. That was simply how the universe functioned. Subcommander Lyral Dova spent those 14 days very differently. She could not sleep. The missing probes gnawed at her mind like an animal chewing at a chain. 0.03%. 14 failures out of 14 attempts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that number glowing in the darkness. Every time she tried to rest, her mind calculated and recalculated the probability until the numbers burned themselves into her thoughts. So she did what she always did when something bothered her. She dug deeper. She pulled every file the Imperial archives had on Sol 3. Most of it was old, decades, sometimes centuries old. The Imperium had never considered Earth important enough for serious study. It was just another primitive world in a galaxy full of primitive worlds, scheduled for eventual conquest when the Empire got around to expanding into that sector. But buried in the data, hidden under layers of low-priority classifications and analyst notes, she found things that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The first discovery was a gravitational survey conducted by a Zerith deep scout vessel that had passed through the Sol system 200 years ago. The ship had taken detailed measurements of every planet and major body in the system. Standard survey work designed to identify resources and hazards. Most of the readings were exactly what you'd expect from a typical star system. Gas giants with predictable gravity wells. Rocky inner planets with standard core compositions. An asteroid belt full of useful metals. But the readings around Earth were not normal. They showed energy signatures beneath the planet's surface that were far too large for a Class 2 civilization. The kind of signatures you would see from deep core power generators or massive underground facilities. Installations that would require technology Earth wasn't supposed to have. The original analyst had flagged it as a possible instrument error and moved on. After all, the surface observations showed a primitive world. The radio transmissions were crude. The visible technology was centuries behind Zerith standards. Clearly, the deep scan readings were corrupted by some local phenomenon, magnetic anomalies, perhaps, or unusual core composition. Lyral stared at that flag for a long time. Possible instrument error. Not confirmed instrument error. Just possible. The analyst had noticed something wrong and chosen the comfortable explanation instead of the troubling one. The second discovery was worse. Lyral pulled up the Imperium's xenological development models, the mathematical curves that predicted how quickly a species advanced from one technological stage to the next. These models have been refined over thousands of years and thousands of conquered species. They were accurate to within a few percentage points. Every known species in the galaxy followed roughly the same developmental curve. It took most civilizations between 8,000 and 12,000 years to go from basic agriculture to nuclear capability. Some were faster, some were slower, but they all followed the same general arc. Slow progress for millennia, then gradual acceleration as they built on previous discoveries. Humanity had reached nuclear capability in about 10,000 years. That was fast, but not impossibly so. Well within normal parameters. What was impossible was the last 200 years. Humans had gone from riding animals and fighting with swords to splitting atoms and walking on their moon in barely 150 years. The development curve didn't just bend. It broke. It went nearly vertical. Lyral pulled up comparison charts. The Polari had taken 4,000 years to make that same jump. The Dvaki had taken 3,000. The Zerith themselves had taken 2,500 years. Humanity had done it in 150. The xenologists who'd reviewed the data had marked it as a statistical anomaly, a freak occurrence. Some species just developed faster than others when certain conditions aligned. Nothing to worry about. Just an interesting data point for the academic archives. But Lyral looked at that curve and saw something else. She saw a species that had suddenly learned something, discovered something, or been given something. The third discovery made her blood run cold. She searched the Imperium's central database for any record of successful contact with a species from the Sol system. Any species, from any time period. Trade records, diplomatic files, war reports, even rumors and myths. She searched for hours, expanding her parameters, checking archive databases, pulling files that hadn't been accessed in centuries. She found nothing. Not a single record. Not one. The Sol system sat in a region of space that dozens of civilizations had explored over the millennia. Survey ships had passed through. Trade routes had skirted its borders. Military patrols had mapped nearby sectors. But no one had ever made contact with anyone from Sol. No trade had ever been established. No wars had ever been fought. No diplomats had ever returned with stories of the strange species living around that yellow star. It was as if Earth sat in the center of a black hole from which no information ever escaped. Ships went in. Nothing came out. Not data. Not warnings. Not even debris. She brought her findings to Grand Admiral Cas on the 11th day of the journey. He listened with the patience of a stone statue. His face showed nothing. His eyes tracked her presentation without comment. When she finished, laying out the energy signatures and the development curve and the complete absence of contact records, he spoke 2 sentences. You are afraid of primitives who cannot even agree among themselves on how to govern a single planet. Return to your station. Lyral returned to her station. She said nothing more to the Admiral. She had done her duty. She had reported the anomalies. What happened next was beyond her authority. But she began quietly calculating the fastest possible retreat route out of the Sol system. Just in case. Just to have the numbers ready if they were needed. She told herself it was simply good tactical planning. She told herself every competent officer prepared for contingencies. She did not tell herself what she really believed, that they were flying into a trap so perfect, so patient, so carefully prepared that the Zerith Imperium, with all its power and all its experience, would never see it coming until it was far too late. 3 light years away, deep beneath the Rocky Mountains on the continent of North America, Colonel Mara Ibanez sat in the command center of a facility that did not officially exist. It had no name on any public record. No satellite photograph had ever captured it. No government budget line mentioned it. The entrance was hidden beneath 3,000 feet of solid granite and another 2,000 feet of reinforced concrete and exotic materials that could absorb or deflect virtually any sensor technology known to exist. To the very few people who knew about it, it was called Solcom, Solar Command. The command center itself was enormous and dark, lit only by the blue glow of holographic displays that floated in the air like electric ghosts. Dozens of officers and technicians sat at curved workstations arranged in concentric circles descending toward the central command platform. They monitored screens that showed data, streams the rest of humanity would not understand for another century. Because humanity had a secret. The biggest secret in the history of the species. It started 63 years ago when a Norwegian fishing boat off the coast of Bergen pulled something out of the deep ocean that was not from Earth. It was a probe. Alien. Damaged by atmospheric entry, but mostly intact. Covered in symbols that no human language could read. Made of materials that no human metallurgy could produce. Within a year, the world's governments have been quietly united under a single classified directive. All conflicts were suddenly negotiable. All borders suddenly became permeable for the right people. All competing interests suddenly found common ground. Within 5 years, they had found 3 more probes scattered across the globe. and a crash scout ship buried under 2 miles of Antarctic ice, preserved in perfect frozen darkness for who knew how long. They took them apart, carefully, meticulously. Teams of scientists working in secret facilities across the globe studied every component, every circuit, every molecule of alien metal. They mapped out technologies that shouldn't exist. They decoded systems built on principles human physics hadn't discovered yet. And then they did what humans had always done better than anything else in the universe. They improved on what they found. The project was called Blackwall. Its purpose was brilliantly simple. Earth would show the galaxy exactly what the galaxy expected to see. A primitive, noisy, divided world full of creatures too busy fighting each other to look up at the stars. A species that posed no threat, offered no challenge, warranted no particular concern. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, behind the curtain, in the deep places where no satellite could see, humanity would build. And build they did. Weapons platforms hidden in the asteroid belt, disguised as mining operations or navigation beacons. Each one carrying enough firepower to destroy a capital ship. Railgun arrays buried beneath the ocean floor, their barrels extending through carefully camouflaged launch tubes that could put a projectile into orbit in under 4 seconds. Each slug carrying the kinetic energy of a nuclear weapon. Antimatter warheads stored in vaults beneath the Sahara Desert, temperature-controlled and magnetically suspended, waiting with infinite patience for the day they might be needed. Sensor networks woven through near-Earth space, so fine, so sensitive, that they could detect a ship dropping out of FTL travel from half a solar system away. They could read the energy signature of an alien engine. They could identify ship classification based on power output alone. And at the center of it all, coordinating everything, directing the vast, invisible machine of Earth's defense. A system so vast and so perfectly hidden that Solcom simply called it the Mesh. 10,000 weapons platforms scattered through the space between Mars and Earth. Each one cloaked with technology reverse-engineered from those first alien probes, and then improved until the cloaking was so perfect that you could be within 100 meters and see nothing but empty space. Each platform networked to every other platform, each one sharing targeting data in real time, each one capable of autonomous operation or coordinated assault. From the outside, Earth looked exactly like what the Zerith intelligence report said it was: a noisy little world full of noisy little creatures burning fossil fuels and arguing about borders. From the inside, Earth was a fortress, a trap, a loaded weapon pointed at the sky, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to be foolish enough to knock on the door. Colonel Mara Ibanez had been waiting for this moment for her entire career. She had trained for it. She had run simulations of it 1,000 times. Every possible scenario, every potential response, every contingency had been war-gamed and analyzed and refined. And 6 days ago, when the long-range sensors picked up a Zerith fleet entering FTL travel on a direct course for Sol, she had felt something she did not expect. She felt calm, the way a person feels when something they've been waiting for their entire life finally arrives. The way a trap feels when prey finally steps into the killing zone. She had watched the fleet for 6 days now as it crossed the light years toward Earth. 480 warships, 12 planet crackers, a dreadnought at the center of the formation. It was the largest hostile force ever directed at Earth. By Zerith standards, it was an overwhelming display of power, an unstoppable armada, a force that had conquered hundreds of worlds. By Solcom's calculations, it was not enough. Not nearly enough. Ibanez stood up from her command chair and looked around the command center. Every officer was at their station. Every system showed green. The mesh was dormant, invisible, patient, spread across millions of cubic kilometers of space like a spider's web waiting for a fly. She spoke one sentence. Her voice was steady and quiet, the way a person speaks when they know exactly what is about to happen and have made peace with it long ago. Wake everything up. Across the solar system, in the silent dark between planets, 10,000 weapons platforms opened their eyes. The 9th Expeditionary Fleet of the Zerith Imperium dropped out of FTL travel just beyond the orbit of Mars. The transition was smooth, practiced, and precise. Stars that had been stretched into lines of light snapped back into sharp points. Space reasserted itself. The universe returned to its normal shape. Sensors powered up immediately and began scanning the system ahead. The tactical displays on every ship filled with data, planetary positions, orbital mechanics, electromagnetic signatures, everything you needed to understand the battlefield. Grand Admiral Vitheran Cas stood at the center of his bridge with his hands clasped behind his back and waited for reports to come in. They came quickly, and they confirmed exactly what he had expected. Nothing. No defense grid. No orbital battle stations. No fleet waiting in defensive formation. No energy shield protecting the planet. No weapon signatures of any kind. Just a small blue planet hanging in the dark, surrounded by primitive satellites and the floating garbage of a species that had barely learned to crawl off its own surface. Radio transmissions leaked from the planet in every direction like noise from a crowded room. Music, arguments, advertisements, the meaningless chatter of billions of creatures who had no idea what was coming. Cas allowed himself a small smile. The first genuine expression of emotion he'd shown in days. "All ships, form Conquest Formation Primus," he ordered. His voice carried across the bridge with absolute authority. "Planet crackers hold position at the rear. Begin approach to Earth orbit." The fleet moved like a living thing. 480 warships spread out into a massive hemisphere, a dome of metal and fire descending toward the little blue world. It was a formation designed to intimidate as much as to destroy. Most species surrendered just at the sight of it. "Open all frequencies," Cas said. "Broadcast the standard ultimatum in every known human language." The communications officer worked his station. "Broadcasting now, Admiral." The message went out at the speed of light, hitting every radio receiver, every satellite, every device on the planet that could pick up a signal. It was simple and direct, as all Zerith ultimatums were. Surrender your world. Lay down your weapons. Kneel before the Imperium, or be destroyed. Cas waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. Silence. No response. No surrender. No panic transmissions. Not even a change in the radio chatter bleeding off the planet. Earth simply continued doing what it had been doing before. Talking, singing, arguing, living as if 480 warships were not hanging above it like a hammer above a nail. Cas felt a flicker of irritation. He had expected fear. He had expected begging. He had at least expected acknowledgement. Some kind of response, even if it was defiant. Even if they refused to surrender, surely they would say something. They did not respond. "Admiral," Lyral said from her station. Her voice was tight, controlled. I recommend we teach them what silence earns," Cas said coldly, cutting her off. "Weapons division, fire a demonstration volley. Target the large desert region on the northern continent. Nothing inhabited. I want them to see what we can do." The forward warships opened fire. Plasma bolts and kinetic rounds streaked toward the planet in bright lines of light. It was a small volley by Zerith standards, enough to turn 100 square kilometers of sand to glass. Enough to create a crater visible from orbit. Enough to make the point very clear. The volley crossed the distance between the fleet and the planet. Thousands of kilometers disappeared in seconds. The weapons reached 400,000 kilometers from Earth's surface. And then they were gone. Not intercepted. Not deflected by shields. Not destroyed by counterfire. They simply ceased to exist. One moment they were there, visible on every sensor, tracked by every targeting system. The next moment they were not. As if they had hit an invisible wall and been swallowed whole. The bridge went dead silent. Every officer stared at their screens. Cas stared at his tactical display, where the weapon tracks simply ended. Stopped. Disappeared. For 3 full seconds, no one said a word. "Report," Cas said. His voice was still calm, but something sharp had entered it, like a crack forming in stone. "Admiral, The weapons officer looked at his readings, then looked again. "It's gone, sir. All projectiles lost. No detonation detected. No debris. No energy signature. They just disappeared." "That is not possible," Cas said. His voice was flat, certain. Fire again. Full salvo from the forward line. 60 warships fired at once. The volley was 10 times larger than the first. Thousands of projectiles screamed toward Earth. Enough firepower to crack a continent. Enough to boil an ocean. They vanished at the same distance. 400,000 kilometers. Every single one. And then something changed. Every sensor on every ship in the fleet screamed at the same time. Alarms that had never gone off before suddenly filled bridges across the fleet with urgent warning sounds. Energy readings spiked across bands that the Zerith had never even named. Readings so high they broke the scales on standard instruments. The empty space around the fleet, the space that had been empty and dark and harmless just moments ago, began to change. It was as if the darkness itself was waking up. Lyra was the first to understand what she was seeing. Her screen showed the space around the fleet filling with contacts. Not ships, not missiles, something else. Thousands of objects appearing out of nothing, decloaking, revealing themselves like predators stepping out of shadows. Weapons platforms, sensor nodes, gravity well generators, railgun batteries, antimatter launchers. They were everywhere, above, below, on every side, in front and behind, surrounding the fleet in a perfect sphere of death. The humans had not been hiding behind Earth. They had been hiding in the space around the fleet all along. For hours, maybe days, waiting with infinite patience for the Zerith to move into position. The entire region of space between Mars and Earth was a kill zone, and the 9th Expeditionary Fleet had walked into the center of it like an animal walking into a cage. "Admiral," Lyra shouted, her voice cracking with something very close to panic. "We need to—" She never finished the sentence. The mesh fired. The first thing to hit them was the railguns. Solid metal, slugs the size of a human fist, accelerated to 80% of the speed of light by magnetic fields so powerful they would have torn apart any ordinary metal. At that velocity, each slug carried the kinetic energy of a nuclear bomb. At that speed, they were barely visible, just streaks of distorted light as they punched through space. They punched through Zerith energy shields as if the shields were not there. Shields that had stopped plasma fire and nuclear detonations simply failed. The slugs passed through like bullets through wet paper. They tore through armored hulls that had survived 100 battles. Armor plating that could withstand temperatures hot enough to melt steel was simply penetrated. The slugs went through one side of a ship and out the other, carrying their terrible kinetic energy into everything in their path. Ships that had survived 100 battles exploded in silence. No sound in the vacuum of space. Just light and debris, breaking apart into clouds of glowing metal and frozen atmosphere, and the frozen bodies of crew who never even had time to scream. A destroyer on the forward line took 3 hits in 2 seconds. Its reactor containment failed. The ship vanished in a sphere of white light that expanded for half a second and then collapsed, leaving nothing but dissipating radiation. Then came the antimatter charges. Small packages, precise, delivered by missiles that moved through space like hunting predators. They appeared inside the fleet's formation like fireflies, tiny points of light that looked almost beautiful for the fraction of a second before they detonated. Each explosion was a perfect sphere of white light that consumed everything within a kilometer. Matter and antimatter annihilating each other with 100% efficiency. Pure conversion of mass to energy. The kind of reaction that powered stars. A cruiser disappeared. Just gone. One moment, it was there, a massive warship bristling with weapons. The next moment, there was only expanding light. A carrier full of ground troops, 3,000 soldiers who had been joking about primitive humans just hours ago, vanished in a flash so bright that sensors on nearby ships burned out. 3,000 lives converted to gamma radiation in a fraction of a second. Then came the electronic warfare. The Zerith officers watched in horror as their own systems turned against them. Targeting computers that had been tracking human weapons platforms suddenly went mad. They locked onto Zerith ships instead. Point defense guns that were supposed to protect them from incoming fire turned and began shooting at the ships next to them. Navigation systems froze, locked up, refused commands. Engines that should have responded to helm control simply didn't. Ships that tried to turn found themselves unable to change course. Communication channels filled with noise, static and feedback, and something else, something that sounded almost like laughter buried in the white noise. The fleet, the greatest military force the Zerith Imperium had ever assembled against a single world, was being torn apart from the inside and the outside at the same time. Ships tried to run. They fired their engines at maximum thrust, trying to break free of the kill zone, trying to reach the edge of the formation and jump to FTL. The gravity, generators caught them. Invisible hands of compressed space-time grabbed ships that were trying to flee and held them perfectly still. Held them like insects in amber, while the railguns and antimatter charges took them apart piece by piece. One destroyer made it almost to the edge. Its engines were at 140% of rated capacity. It was tearing itself apart, trying to escape. For a moment, it looked like it might actually break free. Then 6 railgun slugs hit it simultaneously. The ship broke in half. Both halves tumbled through space for several seconds before secondary explosions tore them into smaller pieces. Grand Admiral Vitheran Cas stood in the center of his bridge and watched his fleet die. The tactical display in front of him was a wall of red. Ship icons blinked out one after another, each blink representing a warship, and every soul aboard it ceasing to exist. Each disappearance happening faster than human eyes could track. Hundreds of ships, thousands of crew, just gone. The sound on the bridge was a continuous alarm, a scream of warning signals that no one could answer, damage reports that no one could address, emergency calls that no one could respond to. Through the viewport, space itself seemed to be on fire. Explosions bloomed in every direction, silent and beautiful and terrible. Each burst of light marking the death of a ship, the death of a crew, the end of lives that had woken up that morning thinking they were going to conquer a primitive world. Cas could not speak. He could not move. His hands hung at his sides and shook like the hands of an old man. His mouth was open, but no words came out. His eyes stared at the carnage, but his mind could not process it. This was not a battle. Battles had tactics. They had strategy. They had moments where skill mattered, where training made a difference, where leadership could change outcomes. This was not even a massacre. Massacres still had defenders who tried to fight back, who died with weapons in their hands and defiance in their hearts. This was something else entirely. This was a species looking at the most powerful fleet in the galaxy and swatting it aside like a human might swat a fly. Without effort, without concern, without mercy. It lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 471 warships were gone. All 12 planet crackers, the weapons that could crack open worlds, were gone. They had never fired a single shot. 60,000 soldiers were dead without ever touching the ground they were supposed to conquer. The space between Mars and Earth was filled with a spreading cloud of wreckage that would orbit the sun for centuries. Debris fields that would puzzle future explorers who might wonder what terrible battle had happened here. 9 ships survived. The Eternal Sovereignty was one of them. Its engines were dead. Its hull was breached in 11 places. Life support was failing. Emergency lights bathed the bridge in red. The air smelled of smoke and burned insulation and the chemical smell of fires that had been automatically suppressed. Cas stood exactly where he had stood 11 minutes ago. He had not moved. He had not spoken. His eyes were open, but they saw nothing. His mind, the brilliant tactical mind that had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds, had simply stopped. It could not process what had happened. It did not have a framework for it. In 12,000 years of Imperial history, there was no word for this. No precedent. No comparison. No way to understand. Lyral pulled herself up from the floor where the shockwaves had thrown her. Blood ran from a cut on her forehead. Around her, officers groaned and coughed in the smoke-filled air. Some were crying. Some sat in stunned silence. All of them looked broken. She looked at the tactical display. 9 green icons floated in a sea of red and gray. 9 ships out of 480. She looked at the Admiral. He stared at nothing, seeing nothing, his mind gone somewhere very far away. She looked at the viewport. Earth hung in the distance, blue and green and white, exactly as it had looked before. Untouched, undamaged, unchanged, as if nothing had happened. As if 480 warships and 60,000 lives meant nothing at all. And in that moment, Subcommander Liral Dova understood something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The humans had not fought them. Fighting implied effort. Fighting implied risk. Fighting implied that the outcome was ever in doubt. The humans had simply cleaned house. Continuing with Aftermath, Message, Return Journey, Emperor's Decision, and Galactic Broadcast, the Eternal Sovereignty drifted in the dark. Its engines were cold. Its shield were gone. 11 breaches in the hull had been sealed with emergency barriers, but the air was thin and tasted of smoke and burned metal. Emergency lighting painted everything in shades of red and shadow. In the lower decks, medics worked on the wounded with dwindling supplies. In the corridors, crew members walked in silence, their faces blank with shock. Some cried quietly. Some just stared at nothing. All of them were trying to understand how they had survived when so many others had not. Grand Admiral Vitheran Cas had not spoken since the battle ended. He sat in his command chair and stared at nothing. His eyes were open but empty, like the windows of a house where no one lived anymore. The officers on the bridge moved around him quietly, as if he were a piece of broken furniture they did not know what to do with. Subcommander Liral Dova took command. No one questioned it. There was no one else. The ranking officers on the other surviving ships were in even worse shape than Cass. Shell-shocked, traumatized, barely functional. She counted what was left. 9 ships, the Eternal Sovereignty, and 8 others. All crippled, all drifting, all holding together with emergency repairs and desperate hope. Of the 60,000 soldiers and crew that had entered the Sol system with pride and confidence, fewer than 4,000 were still alive. Liral stood at the communication station and tried to send a signal to the nearest Imperial relay. The long-range communications array was damaged. She got nothing but static. They were alone, surrounded by the wreckage of their fleet, floating in enemy space with no weapons, no engines, and no way to call for help. And then a signal came in. It did not come on any Zerith military frequency. It came on an open channel, unencrypted, broadcast from somewhere near Earth. And it was not in any human language. It was in perfect Imperial Zerith. Every word was pronounced correctly. Every grammatical structure was flawless. The accent was strange, the voice shaped by a mouth evolved for different sounds. But the language was perfect, better than perfect, more precise than most Zerith spoke their own tongue. The voice was human, a woman's voice, calm and measured, speaking the language of the Imperium as if she had spoken it her entire life. This is Colonel Mara Ibanez of Solar Command. Your fleet entered sovereign human space without authorization. Your hostile intent was noted. Your attack was absorbed. We have chosen to leave survivors so that a message may be delivered. You will listen now. The bridge went absolutely still. Every surviving officer turned to look at the communications console. Even Cass stirred in his chair, his dead eyes flickering with something that might have been awareness. The voice continued. These are the terms of your departure. They are not negotiable. First, the Zerith Imperium will not enter the Sol system again. Any ship that crosses the boundary of our outer sensor network will be destroyed without warning. No ultimatum, no demonstration, no second chances. Second, any further hostile action taken against humanity, whether direct or through proxy agents, will be answered with a response delivered to Zerith Prime itself. We know where your homeworld is. We have known for a very long time. We know the orbital parameters of your planet crackers. We know the defensive positions of your home fleet. We know everything. A pause. Then the voice continued, and there was something almost gentle in it now. Almost kind. Third, you should understand that what you experienced today was not the full extent of our capability. It was not close to the full extent of our capability. We used a fraction of available resources. We operated at reduced power settings. We held back significantly. Take this knowledge home with you. Silence. The bridge was so quiet that Liral could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then the voice spoke once more. Softer now, almost conversational, the way you might speak to someone who needed reassurance. Your engines will be repaired remotely. You will find that your drive systems are powering up now. We have taken the liberty of making the necessary adjustments. Your navigation computers have been programmed with a safe route out of our space. You are free to leave. Do not return. Lyra looked at the engineering readout. Her breath caught in her throat. The engines were coming online. Not through anything the Zerith engineers had done. Not through any repairs they had made. The systems were activating on their own, as if invisible hands were reaching into the ship and turning the switches. As if the humans were sitting at their own consoles in some distant facility, casually operating Zerith systems like they owned them. Because they did own them. The humans were inside their systems. They had cracked Zerith security. They could control the ship. They could shut it down. They could make it dance like a puppet. The humans were not just defeating them. The humans were showing them very clearly that they had never been in control. Not from the moment they entered this system. Maybe not from the moment they left Zerith Prime. Lyra felt sick. Before the channel closed, she pressed the transmit button. Her voice was raw and tired and shaking, but she needed to ask. Needed to know. Colonel Ibanez, how long have you been able to do this? There was a pause. A brief, terrible pause that carried more weight than any weapon the humans had fired. More frightening than the railguns, or the antimatter, or the electronic warfare. In that pause, Lyra understood that the answer was going to be worse than she imagined. Longer than you would be comfortable knowing, said the voice. And then the channel went dead. The 9 surviving ships turned and limped out of the Sol system. Their repaired engines moved them at half-standard speed, which meant the journey home would take weeks instead of days. Weeks spent crawling through the vast silence of deep space with nothing but time and the memory of what had happened. Lyra spent those weeks studying the battle data. She went over every second of the 11-minute engagement, frame by frame, reading by reading, until her eyes burned and her head ached, and she could see the tactical displays when she closed her eyes. And the more she studied it, the worse it got. The railgun slugs had been traveling at 80% of the speed of light. That was fast enough to punch through any shield the Imperium had ever built. Fast enough that relativistic effects made them nearly impossible to track or intercept. But the targeting data showed that the railguns had been operating at reduced power. Their maximum acceleration capability, based on the energy signatures Lyra had recorded, suggested they could push projectiles to 95% of the speed of light. The humans had turned down the power. They had not needed the full setting. They had used 80% because that was sufficient. Because even at reduced power, the Zerith shields were meaningless. The antimatter warheads that had vaporized entire squadrons were, according to Lyra's analysis, the smallest warheads in the human arsenal, the equivalent of sidearms. Personal weapons. The energy signatures recorded during the battle suggested that the larger platforms in the mesh carried warheads hundreds of times more powerful. Warheads that had never been activated. Warheads that had sat quietly in their launchers because they were not needed. The electronic warfare systems that had seized control of Zerith targeting computers had done so in less than 2 seconds. 2 seconds to crack encryption protocols that the Imperium's best scientists had spent centuries developing. Encryption that was supposed to be mathematically unbreakable. And the hacking had been surgical. Precise. The humans had not simply jammed their systems. They had taken control of specific subsystems on specific ships and turned them against specific targets with perfect coordination. It was the technological equivalent of reaching into someone's brain and making them punch themselves. And then there was the matter of the 9 ships. Lyra ran the probability calculations over and over. In a battle that one-sided, the chance of 9 ships surviving by luck was effectively 0.0003%. So close to impossible that it might as well be impossible. The humans had not missed them. The humans had not lost track of them in the chaos. The humans had deliberately, intentionally, and precisely chosen to leave 9 ships intact. They had left survivors on purpose. A dead fleet tells no stories. A dead fleet leaves the Imperium wondering what happened and potentially sending more ships to investigate. That was dangerous. That could lead to escalation. That could lead to more conflict. But 9 crippled ships limping home with terrified crews and complete battle data, that tells a very specific story. That delivers a very specific message. The humans had not just won a battle. They had written a message in the wreckage of 471 warships and sent it home with the survivors. The message was simple: do not come here again. The 9 ships reached Zerith Prime after 26 days of travel. They were met by a patrol fleet that escorted them to the orbital docks in stunned silence. Word spread fast. Within hours, everyone knew. The 9th Expeditionary Fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, sent to conquer a primitive backwater, had been almost completely destroyed. 471 ships lost, 60,000 dead, and the planet they had been sent to conquer remained untouched. The news reached the Imperial Palace within hours. Emperor Vitheran summoned Lyral to the throne room. He was old, ancient by Zerith standards. His skin was like gray paper stretched over sharp bones. But his eyes were bright and hard and missed nothing. He sat on the ivory throne, carved from the bones of the first species the Zerith had ever conquered 12,000 years ago, and listened as Lyral presented her report. She had nothing. She showed the battle recordings. She shared her analysis. She spoke of the reduced power settings and the deliberate survivors, and the voice of Colonel Ibanez, speaking perfect Imperial Zerith. When she finished, the throne room erupted. War Minister Cole Divin slammed his fist on the table and demanded immediate retaliation. "Send 1,000 fleets," he shouted, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "Send every ship in the Imperium. We will burn that world to ash and salt the ground where it stood." Other ministers shouted their agreement. The noise filled the throne room like a storm. Pride and fury and 12,000 years of unchallenged dominance roared in the voices of the most powerful people in the galaxy. They had never lost. They did not know how to lose. The very concept was alien to them. The Emperor raised one hand. The room went silent instantly. Absolutely. As if sound itself had ceased to exist. Vitheran looked at the battle recording one more time. He watched 480 warships disappear in 11 minutes. He watched the planet called Earth float serenely in the aftermath, untouched and unconcerned. He thought about the voice on the recording, calm and precise, speaking the language of the Imperium as if she owned it, as if she had studied it for years, as if she knew everything about them. He thought about the missing probes, all 14 of them, sent over more than a century, all destroyed or captured. He thought about 0.03%, about impossible probabilities, about traps 100 years in the making. And then the oldest and most powerful ruler in the galaxy said 5 words that no Zerith Emperor had ever said before. "We will not go back." The war minister opened his mouth to protest. The Emperor looked at him, just looked, and the war minister closed his mouth and sat down. Lyral stood in the great throne room of the Zerith Imperium and watched the most powerful civilization in the galaxy quietly and carefully decide to be afraid. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the galaxy had changed forever in those 11 minutes above Earth. Something old had ended. Something new had begun. She just did not know yet what it was. But 3 days later, Earth sent another message. Not just to the Zerith Imperium. To everyone. Every species. Every world. Every ship with a receiver capable of picking up electromagnetic radiation. The message was broadcast on every frequency. It reached trade ships and military vessels and orbital stations and planetary receivers. It reached slave worlds and free worlds and worlds that had forgotten what freedom meant. On a dusty border world at the edge of Zerith space, a merchant named Talek Silver sat in his small ship and watched his communication screen light up with a signal he had never seen before. It was not Zerith. It was not from any species he recognized. The header identified the source simply as Earth Sol System. He read the message. Then he read it again. Then he sat very still for a long time. Around him, on 10,000 worlds across the galaxy, other people were reading the same message. Slaves in Zerith mines, soldiers in Zerith garrisons, merchants on trade routes, scientists in laboratories, mothers holding their children, old men who had given up hope decades ago. They all read the same words. And for a moment, the galaxy held its breath. The message said, "To all civilizations held under the authority of the Zerith Imperium, you're not alone. You have not been forgotten. We have been watching. We have been preparing. We have seen your suffering. We have recorded your stories. The long silence is over. Help is coming. Earth." Talek Silver stared at the words glowing on his screen. He read them over and over until they burned themselves into his memory, until he could recite them with his eyes closed. Somewhere deep inside his chest, in a place that 12,000 years of Imperial rule had tried to crush and silence and kill, something stirred. Something warm. Something dangerous. It was hope. And across the galaxy, in the cold and ancient halls of the Imperial Palace on Zerith Prime, Emperor Vitheran received the same message. He read it once. He set down the datapad. He looked out the window at the stars that his ancestors had conquered and ruled for 12 millennia. And for the first time in his very long life, the Emperor of the Zerith Imperium felt afraid. Not of weapons, not of fleets, not of technology. He was afraid of something far more dangerous than any of those things. He was afraid of what happens when a galaxy full of broken people is given a reason to stand up. When she finished, the throne room erupted. War Minister Cole Divin slammed his fist on the table and demanded immediate retaliation. "Send 1,000 fleets," he shouted, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls. "Send every ship in the Imperium. We will burn that world to ash and salt the ground where it stood." Other ministers shouted their agreement. The noise filled the throne room like a storm. Pride and fury and 12,000 years of unchallenged dominance roared in the voices of the most powerful people in the galaxy. They had never lost. They did not know how to lose. The very concept was alien to them. The Emperor raised one hand. The room went silent instantly. Absolutely. As if sound itself had ceased to exist. Vitheran looked at the battle recording one more time. He watched 480 warships disappear in 11 minutes. He watched the planet called Earth float serenely in the aftermath, untouched and unconcerned. He thought about the voice on the recording, calm and precise, speaking the language of the Imperium as if she owned it, as if she had studied it for years, as if she knew everything about them. He thought about the missing probes, all 14 of them, sent over more than a century, all destroyed or captured. He thought about 0.03%, about impossible probabilities, about traps 100 years in the making. And then the oldest and most powerful ruler in the galaxy said 5 words that no Zerith Emperor had ever said before. "We will not go back." The War Minister opened his mouth to protest. The Emperor looked at him, just looked, and the War Minister closed his mouth and sat down. Lyral stood in the great throne room of the Zerith Imperium and watched the most powerful civilization in the galaxy quietly and carefully decide to be afraid. And she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the galaxy had changed forever in those 11 minutes above Earth. Something old had ended. Something new had begun. She just did not know yet what it was. But 3 days later, Earth sent another message. Not just to the Zerith Imperium. To everyone. Every species. Every world. Every ship with a receiver capable of picking up electromagnetic radiation. The message was broadcast on every frequency. It reached trade ships and military vessels and orbital stations and planetary receivers. It reached slave worlds and free worlds and worlds that had forgotten what freedom meant. On a dusty border world at the edge of Zerith space, a merchant named Talek Silver sat in his small ship and watched his communication screen light up with a signal he had never seen before. It was not Zerith. It was not from any species he recognized. The header identified the source simply as Earth's Sol System. He read the message. Then he read it again. Then he sat very still for a long time. Around him, on 10,000 worlds across the galaxy, Other people were reading the same message. Slaves in Zerith mines, soldiers in Zerith garrisons, merchants on trade routes, scientists in laboratories, mothers holding their children, old men who had given up hope decades ago. They all read the same words. And for a moment, the galaxy held its breath. The message said, "To all civilizations held under the authority of the Zerith Imperium, you're not alone. You have not been forgotten. We have been watching. We have been preparing. We have seen your suffering. We have recorded your stories. The long silence is over. Help is coming. Earth." Talek Silver stared at the words glowing on his screen. He read them over and over until they burned themselves into his memory, until he could recite them with his eyes closed. Somewhere deep inside his chest, in a place that 12,000 years of Imperial rule had tried to crush and silence and kill, something stirred. Something warm. Something dangerous. It was hope. And across the galaxy, in the cold and ancient halls of the Imperial Palace on Zerith Prime, Emperor Zyle Varithi received the same message. He read it once. He set down the datapad. He looked out the window at the stars that his ancestors had conquered and ruled for 12 millennia. And for the first time in his very long life, the Emperor of the Zerith Imperium felt afraid. Not of weapons, not of fleets, not of technology. He was afraid of something far more dangerous than any of those things. He was afraid of what happens when a galaxy full of broken people is given a reason to stand up.